We continue now at the top of Daf Zayin Amud Beis in Meseches Makkos. This is Makkos Daf 7b. The Mishnah continues, Haya Ola Besulam, if a person was going up a ladder, V'nafal Olav V'hargo, and then on his way up, he then falls off the ladder and he kills the person, Hareza Eino Golas, so in that case, he would not go to Golas. Again, as we mentioned on the previous Amud, Zeh HaKlal, the rule is as follows. Kol Shebederech Yirida, so as long as it's a downward motion and he kills by mistake, Golas, so then he is exiled. V'shelo Bederech Yirida, so but if it's not a downward motion, then Eino Gola, then he does not go to exile. And the Gemara says, Menohani Mili, from where do we know this? Amar Shmuel, Shmuel says, the Amar Kra, it's because the Pasuk says, Vayapil Ola Vayamos, it uses that word Vayapil, that he falls upon him, Ad Sheyipol Derech Nefila. It means it has to be Derech Nefila, he has to fall in the downward motion, in the way of falling. And the Gemara continues, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Bishgaga, it says in the Pasuk, Bishgaga, it happens by mistake. Prat Lemezid, that comes to exclude, if it's done on purpose. And Bivli Das, it says that it's done without knowledge. Prat Lemeskaven, that comes to exclude a situation where it's done with intent. And we'll read the full psukim over here. The pasuk says, "V'ikrisam lachem orim mikla tiena lachem v'nos shama rotzeach makei nefesh bishgaga." Again, it says makei nefesh bishgaga. That means it has to be by mistake, as the Brisa said, to exclude a situation of mezid. And then the other pasuk, it says in the pasuk, "V'zeh dvar harotzeach asher yonos shama v'chay asher yakes reu bivli das." It says that he strikes his friend bivli das without knowledge, and that's what the Brisa is saying. Pralim eskavin, to exclude a situation where he does have intention. And the Gemara continues, Mezid, in a situation where it's on purpose, Pshita, it's obvious that he doesn't go to Golas, because Bar Ketaluhu, because in such a situation, he's going to get the death penalty. And the Gemara says, Amar Rava says, Ema, rather we should say, Pradla Omer Mutter, that it's not to exclude B'mezid, because again, that's obvious, but it comes to exclude a situation where the person says it was Mutter, he thought it was permissible, what he was doing. And we'll note that the Mesoras Hashas says that it shouldn't be Rav over here, but rather it should be Rabbah. And the Gemara continues, Amar Le Abaye said back to him, he said back to Rabbah, I Omer Mutter, if you're talking about a case of Omer Mutter, Onosu, that's a situation of Ones, and so that's not going to be considered Mezid at all. How can you say that Prat LeMezid is a reference to Omer Mutter? Amar Le, so he said back to him, Rabbah said back to Abaye, Shani Omer, that I say, Ha-Omer Mutter Karov LeMezid, that a person who's Omer Mutter is actually close to Mezid, and that's what it meant in the Brisa when it said Prat LeMezid, it meant to be excluding Omer Mutter, which is Karov LeMezid. And Rashi explains, Ba'omer mutter savar shemutter la'arugas Yisrael. He thought that it was mutter to kill a Jewish person, v'zeu mezid shelo, and that is his mezid. And again, onesu, the question was, isn't that a situation of onus? V'hechu koreu mezid. How can that be referred to as b'mezid? And the Gemara continues, the Brisa said, Bivli das prat lemiskavin, that if he does it without knowledge, that comes to exclude a situation where he had intention. And again, the Gemara says, miskavin, if he had intention, pshita, it's obvious, bar katalu, in such a situation, he's a bar katalu, he's liable to the death penalty. Amar Rabba says, prat lemiskavin laroges habehema, v'harages ha'adam. What we mean to say is to exclude a case where the person had intention to kill an animal, and instead he killed a person. Lakusi, he had intention to kill a kusi, v'harages Yisrael, and instead he killed a Jew. L'neifel, he had intention to kill a nefel, which is a non-viable baby, v'harag ben kayam, and then he killed someone who was viable. That's actually what the Brisa means. And the Gemara continues, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Im bepesa, the pasuk says if it happens suddenly. We'll read the full pasuk. The pasuk says, Vim bepesa below eva, if suddenly without hatred hadafo, he pushes him, o hishlech olav kol kali below tzidia, or he throws upon him any kind of vessel without premeditation. And the Brisa continues and says, Im bepesa is prat lekeren zavis. When it says Im bepesa, he does it suddenly. That comes to exclude a situation where he kills him when he rounds the corner. And below eva, without hatred, prat lesoni, that comes to exclude an enemy. And hadafo, he pushes him. Shadachfa begufo, he pushes him with his body. O hishlech olav, he throws upon him. Lahavi yurida shit sorech aliyah, that comes to include a situation which is a downward motion, but it's for the purpose of going upward. And below tzidia, again, without premeditation, prat lemiskav, that comes to exclude a case where he had intention to go to one side, and then it went to the other side. And the Gemara continues, the pasuk says, V'asher lo tzada, and he did not lie in wait. Prat lemiskavin lizrok shtayim v'zarak arba. That comes to exclude a situation where he had intention to throw something 2 amos, and instead he threw it 4 amos. V'asher yavo esrayeu bayar, and then it says he comes upon his friend in the forest. And on that the Brisa says, Ma'yar rishus lanizik ulamazik likones l'sham. Just like a forest is a place where both the person being damaged and the damager have permission to enter there. Afkol rishus lanizik ulamazik likones l'sham. So too, we're talking always about scenarios where it's places where the nizik and the mazik nizik are allowed to enter. And Rashi explains, Bepesa prat lekeren zavis, again, suddenly that excludes rounding a corner. Shaloshan pesu besamuch kidim targamina betak, if it means nearby. Prat lekeren zavis, that comes to exclude a corner. Im hayazayotzi mimavoizeh, meaning, if this person was exiting one alleyway, v'nichnas lazeni enters another one, lifnos liyamin o l'smol, turning right or left, v'sakino biyado, and his knife is in his hand, v'zeba kenegdo bekeren zavis, the other one's walking the other direction, around the corner, v'lo ra'o, and he doesn't see him, v'harago, and he kills him. We're coming to exclude that from Golus. And Shadachva begufo means he pushed him with his body below Meskavin without intention. Lahavi Yerida Shitzorech Aliyah, to include a downward motion for the purpose of going upward. Kagon Harotza Laharim Yado Bekoach. Let's say a person wants to lift his hand with strength. The Garzan Biyado, the axe is in his hand. Umashbil Tchilas Kufa, so he first lowers his body. Veshocha Lafan, if he bends forward, Kadei Laharim Bekoach, in order to lift it with strength. Uvashpalaso Harag, and then when he's coming on that downward motion, he ends up killing. The low tema, don't say Hoel V'tzorach Alihu, since it's all for the purpose of going up. Pater, he's Pater Migolus in that case, he's Pater from exile. To Haksiv Vayapel, it says Vayapel, again, it has to be a downward motion, and we're saying even a downward motion, that's L'tzorach Aliyah, is good enough. And Rashi continues below Tzediyah, again without premeditation. Lashon Siddur Shalom Iskavin L'tzadid L'tzad Sheni. We're understanding that to mean that he did not have intention to go to that second side. V'asher Lo Tzad, and again he did not plan it. Shalom Iskavin Lizrok Betzido, he didn't want to throw to his side. U'v'samach lo, and nearby. Ela L'makom Shazarak, rather to the place that he threw. Avalo Hayodeya Sheyesh Sham Adam, but he didn't know that a person was over there, meaning it has to be specifically where it goes, where he intended to throw it, but he did not know that a person is there. Pradlam Eskaven, Lizrok Shtayim, V'zarak Arba, to exclude if he has intention to throw 2, but he throws 4. V'chein Lizrok Arba, V'zarak Shmona, the same thing would be true if he had intention to throw 4 and he threw 8. And Af Kol Sheyesh Lo Reshus LaNizik, it has to be an area where both the Nizik and the Mazik can enter. Yotza Chotzer Shel Balabais, that would exclude if the property was private property. And the Gemara continues, Boy minei Rabbi Yavo me Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yavo asked Rabbi Yochanan the following question. Haya'ola besulam, let's say a person is going up a ladder, v'nishmat hashliva mitachtav, and then one of the rungs, it slips from beneath him, v'nafla v'hargon, it falls and it kills mahu. What's the halach in that situation? Is that considered a downward motion that goes to Golus or not? Ki hagavna aliyahi o yeridahi. Is that a situation of an upward motion, or is it a situation of a downward motion? And the Gemara continues, Amarle, he said back to him, Kvar nagata b'yerida, we already dealt with the case of going down for the purpose of going up, which we said is in fact considered Yerida, it's considered going down, and Chayiv Golus. Rashi explains, Aliyahi o Yeridahi basar didei azlin, and do we follow what he's doing? V'huaya asuk ba'aliyah, he's going up. O basar shliva azlin, maybe we go after the rung. V'ha'ola aliyah, v'ha'ola aleha, rather, hayadochko mashpila klape mata, the person who's going on top of the rung is actually pushing the rung downward, so that's a downward motion. And the answer was kavar nagata, hari nagata kan be Yerida shitza rechaliyah. This is the same case as a downward, that's for the purpose of going up. The rung is going down while the person is going up. We said earlier that in that case the person is in fact chayiv to go to Golus. And the Gemara continues, Eisva, we have the following question. Zeh klal, this is the rule, kol shebederech yiridaso gola, as long as it's a downward motion, he's exiled. Shelo bederech yiridaso eno gola. If it's not a downward motion, then he does not go to exile. And so the Gemara says, Shelo bederech yiridaso lesuye mai. When it says not a downward motion, what is that coming to include? That seems to be including some other case that we did not yet mention. Lav la asuye ki haigavna. Isn't it including exactly this kind of case? This case of going up the ladder, and it's saying that that's not considered a situation of Yerida, that's not considered a case, that's not a case where the person would go to Golus. But the Gemara says you can't ask that question, because according to your reasoning, kol shebederech yiridaso lesuye mai. What about in the other part of the Mishnah where it says anything that's going downward, where we say he is chayav Golus, what's that coming to include? You could equally argue that is also including this case of the ladder. And so the Gemara instead says, Elo rather lesuye katzov. You're going to say that it's including a case of a katzav, a butcher, as the Gemara is about to explain. Hachanami lesuye katzav. So over here also, it's to include the case of the butcher. And the Gemara continues and explains, the Tanya, as we learned in a Brisa, Katzav Shoyim Mekatzev, if you have a butcher who is butchering, Tana Chada Lefanav Chayev La'achar Pater. In one Brisa it says, when he's doing it in front of him, he's Chayev. When he's doing it behind him, then he's Pater, then he doesn't go to Golus. That's one Brisa. But Tanya Yidach, there's another Brisa that says the exact opposite. Li'achar of Chayev, behind him is Chayev, Lefanav Pater, in front of him is Pater. But Tanya Yidach, and then there's a third Brisa which says, Bein Lefanav, Bein La'achar of Chayev, it doesn't matter if it's in front or behind, he's chayiv. And then there's a fourth brisa that says bein lefanav bein le'achar pater. Doesn't matter if it's in front of him or behind him, it's pater. And so how do we explain all these various brisas? And the Gemara says v'lo kash, it's not difficult, because it all depends exactly what part of the motion he is in when he's chopping whatever it is he's chopping. As the Gemara now explains, kan be yerida shalafanav, when the person is chopping, the butcher is chopping, so he'll be going, there's a downward motion in front of him, v'aliyah shalacharav, and then there might be an upward motion that's behind him. And so therefore that would explain the first brisa. Again, the first brisa says that lefan of chayiv, that's the downward motion the person does at the beginning when he's gathering his force. And then it said that in the first brisa it said li'achar pater, because there's a time when the person is going in an upward motion behind him with the knife. And similarly, kan ba'aliyah shalafanav, in one case you're talking the brisa which makes the distinction in the other direction, that's talking about in an upward motion in front of him, which would not be liable to golus, v'yarida shalachar, and then there's the downward motion that's behind him, that would be liable to golus. And then kan b'yarida shalafanav v'shalacharav, the brisa that said chayiv both, that's in the downward motion in front of him and behind him. And kan ba'aliyah shalafanav v'shalacharav, and the one that said pater both, that's in the upward motion in front of him and behind him. And Rashi explains, kol derech aliyah pater, the point of the Gemara is anytime he's going up it's pater, v'chol derech yarida chayiv, anytime down is chayiv. Hilka chadatanya, therefore the brisa which says lefanav chayiv le'achra pater, in front of him is chayiv and behind him is pater, that's b'yarida shalafanav, that's the downward motion in front of him, v'aliyah shalachrav, in the upward motion behind him, which means as follows: hishpil's roa kadei laharim b'koach, first he lowers his arm in order to get a good amount of strength when he's going to lift up, v'herim mikoach lefanav, and then he lifts up in front of him with strength, b'hashpol laso chayiv, so that lowering his chayiv, harag if he kills, ba'aliyaso la'achora pater, but then when he's coming in the upward motion behind him, he's going to be pater. V'hadatanya le'achrav chayiv lefanav pater, the brisa which said the reverse, that behind him is chayiv and in front of him is pater, ba'aliyah shalafanav, that's when he's doing an upward motion in front of him, v'yarida shalachrav, in the downward motion behind him, can go in hamerim yada b'koach ad sheishbilo derech achor, if he's in the middle of lifting his hand with strength in front of him, that's upward in front of him, until he lowers the knife behind him. Mimalich seifav, again he's lifting it above his shoulders, and then v'chazer v'igbion lahakos lefanav, and then he's going to lift it up back to strike in front of him, harag b'hashpoloso derech achor of chayiv. So if he would kill as it's going down behind him, he's chayiv, and harag b'hagbaso pater. If he kills as it's going upward, then he's pater. V'hadatanya bein lefanav bein la'achar of chayiv, the brisa which says both directions is chayiv, in front of him and behind him, that's b'yarida shalafanav o shalacharav, that's going downward motion in front or behind him. V'hadatanya bein lefanav bein la'achar pater, the brisa which said it doesn't matter in front of him or behind him pater, ba'aliyah shalafanav o shalacharav, that's talking about the upward motion that's in front of him and behind him. And the Gemara continues, Lema ketanoi, let us say it's a machlokas tanoim. This is in the issue of going up the ladder and the rung is going downward. It says, Haya ola besula minishbenta shliva mitachtav. This exact case, he's going up a ladder and the rung slips from beneath him. Tani chadachayiv v'tani idach pater. One brisa says chayiv, the other brisa says pater. Ma'ila b'hakameflagi, aren't they arguing on this exact issue? Demar savar yeridahi, umar savar aliyahi. One says it's considered to be a downward motion. The other one says it's considered to be an upward motion. And the Gemara says, lo, no, the alma aliyah, it could be that everybody agrees it's an upward motion. Velo kash, and it's not difficult. Kan linizak and kan legolus. In one case, we're talking about damages. In one case, golus. Of course, if it's an upward motion, there is no golus, there's no exile. But in terms of damages, he would be chayiv. Rashi says linizak and chayiv. For damages, he's chayiv. Im lo hargo ela hiziko. Let's say he didn't kill, but he damaged. Chayiv, then he's chayiv. The linizak and lo shani lan ben shogeg lemezid ben yirid aliyah. When it comes to damages, we don't make a distinction between mistake and on purpose. We don't make a distinction between going in a downward motion or an upward motion. And the Gemara continues, if you want, I could say hava ha legolus. It could be that they're both situations, both brises are talking about exile, velokash, and it's not difficult. Had the isliya, had the lo isliya, depends if it's rotting, if the rung is rotten with worms or not. And Rashi explains, had the isliya chayev, if it's rotten with worms, he's chayev, shekol shliva sheisliya, because when the rung is rotted out, kishadarsan oleh, so then when you stop step on it, it really bends downward. For Yerida, that would be a downward motion. But if it's firm, so then Ein Kan Yerida, then you don't have a Yerida. That's another possibility. If you want, I could say Hava Hadalowesli. In both cases, we're talking about where the rung is firm, Velokasha, or the rung is not rotted out, rather. Velokasha, but it's not difficult. Hadamahadik, Vahadalomahadik. In one case, it's very tight where it is, it's very firm. In the other case, it's a little bit loose. Rashi says, Hadamahadik, Imhoisa Shliva Mole Hanekev, Shi Techuvabo, Vachuza Yafa. Sometimes that rung is very well, it's stuck in the hole very properly. Yafa, Ein Kan Derech Yerida, so then it doesn't go down at all. Upater is pater, Lo Mahadik, but if it's not so tight, Yerida Yeshkan, then it will go down V'chayiv, and he would be Chayiv. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Nishmat habarzel mikato. Let's say the blade, it slips from the handle of the axe, and then v'harag, then it kills. Rebbe Omer eino gola. Rebbe says in that case, he does not go to exile. V'chachamim omrim gola, and the Chachamim say in that case, he is exiled. As the Gemara will explain, it's a discussion of how to understand the psukim. Min ha'etz ha'mispakeya, if the tree that he's chopping, if the wood goes flying and kills somebody, Rebbe Omer gola, Rebbe says he goes to golus in that case. V'chachamim omrim eino gola, and the Chachamim say he does not go to Golus in that case. And the Gemara says, Tanya, we learned in a brayso, Amar lahem Rebbe l'chachamim, Rebbe said to the Chachamim, V'chi nemar v'noshel habarzel mei eitzo, does it say that the blade, it slipped from its handle? V'halo lo nemar ela min ha'etz, it says from the eitz, which indicates the tree. We're talking about the wood from the tree that goes flying. That's the case of the pasuk which talks about Golus. V'yod and further, nemar eitz lamato v'nemar eitz lamalo, it says the word eitz below, and it says also above in the pasuk, lichros ha'etz, which clearly is talking about the tree. Eitz ha'amar lamala, just like the eitz which is mentioned above, to cut the eitz, which is the tree, min ha'etz ha'mispakeya, that's the tree, that's the wood that's being chopped, af eitz ha'amar lamato min ha'etz ha'mispakeya, so too, the word eitz, which it says below, it's talking about, again, the wood from the tree is going flying as he's chopping the wood, and that's what's causing the killing. That's how Rebbe understands the pasuk. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Chia Barashi, Amar Rav Chia Barashi says, that Rav says, Ushneya mikra echad darshu, they're really both darshaning, meaning both Rebbe and the Chachamim, they're darshaning the same pasuk. It says, V'noshel habarzel min ha'etz, again the same pasuk, that the blade, it slips from the eitz. The question is, again, are we talking about the wood from the tree that's going flying, or the blade goes flying off the handle? Rebbe Sava, Rebbe holds Yesh Eim L'Masores, that the way we understand the pasuk is the way that it is written, and the way that it is written, V'nishel ksiv, it's actually written as V'nishel, essentially it causes the wood from the tree to go flying. V'Rabbanan Savri, and the Rabbanan, they hold Yesh Eim L'Mikra, the way we interpret the pasuk is the way it's read, V'noshal Korinan, and the way we read the pasuk is V'noshal, which again would imply the blade is slipping off of the handle. And the Gemara continues, V'Rebbe Yesh Eim L'Masores Svirole, does Rebbe really hold Yesh Eim L'Masores? And Rashi explains, Yesh Eim L'Masores Kemasha Nimsura Ksav Shel Teva L'Moshe, the way it was written over, the word was written to Moshe Rabbeinu on Ritzrichen L'Darsha. That's how we have to darshan it. V'lo Lefi HaMikra Kishata Kore, not the way that it's read. V'noshal, when it comes to the word v'noshal, ata mosif havara shel aleph o shel hey bein nun l'shin. What we're really doing is we're adding a pronunciation of either an aleph or a hey between the nun and the shin. When we read it v'noshal, that's really what we're doing. We're sort of adding a silent, so to speak, letter between the nun and the shin. Ulefi hamasores, but according to the tradition of the way it's written, v'nishel ksiv, it actually was written v'nishel. That's how you would actually read it if you don't insert, so to speak, those letters of pronunciation. Upeirusho nishel shehishel habarzel min ha'etz ha'mispakeya u'motzes re'eh. If we're going to understand it v'nishel, so that causes that the blade of the axe is causing the wood from the tree to go flying and to hit somebody. For Rabbanan savri yeshem l'mikra, the Rabbanan say you go by the way it's read, v'nashal karin, and we read it as v'nashal, lashon pal habarzel atzmo, nashal me'al etzo. That would sound like the blade itself is slipping off of its handle, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Ches Amud Aleph.